who have not been recorded, who wish to be recorded? And clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, there are 17 ayes and 23 noes.
The amendment is not agreed to. Are there any further amendments to the amendment in nature of a substitute? For what purpose does Mr. Steube seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk, Mr. Chairman.
Clerk will report the amendment.
I reserve a point of order.
Point of order is reserved.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 350, offered by Mr. Steube of Florida. Page 5, beginning on line 14, strike white supremacists and neo-Nazis and insert neo-Nazis, white supremacists, Antifa, Black Lives Matter, and radicalized social justice organizations. Page 5, beginning on line 15. Strike white.
The amendment will be considered as read. The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My amendment would ensure that the most dangerous left-wing groups in this country are included in the enhanced reporting, training, and interagency cooperation portions of this bill. This amendment would include Antifa, Black Lives Matter, and radicalized social justice groups alongside neo-Nazis and white supremacists for purpose of reporting in Section 3, training in Section 4, and the interagency task force in Section 5 of the bill. Radicalized groups like Antifa and BLM have terrorized this country for years now. The summer of 2020 saw cities under siege, murders, and other unspeakable acts committed by these groups. On June 2nd, 2020, retired police officer David Dorn was brutally murdered by BLM rioters. In Seattle in 2020, rapes and murders occurred inside the Antifa-dominated CHOP zone. Last October, a violent left-wing mob swarmed the Department of Interior and fought their way inside a federal building. And just last month, BLM worked to free a cold-blooded attempted assassin in Kentucky. A, quote, social justice activist attempted to assassinate a mayoral candidate in Louisville. And what did BML do? They fought to free their violent comrade. Perhaps most relevant to this amendment, these groups have made eliminating the police a mission. Some have disingenuously called this reimagining the police, but in fact, the goal is defunding and elimination. BLM and Antifa have openly targeted law enforcement, and we should be very concerned about their aims to infiltrate law enforcement and the uniformed service. This amendment would protect against that threat. A lot has changed since the last time this committee considered this bill. We have seen what happens when federal law enforcement overreaches, as they have done in response to January 6th and with parents at school board meetings. There are countless reasons to oppose the underlying bill, and I do, but at least this amendment would make some positive change. With this amendment, federal law enforcement would be empowered to protect Americans from the violent far left, and I urge my colleagues to support my amendment.
I withdraw my point of order, Mr. Chairman.
Point of order is withdrawn. Gentleman is yielded back. I recognize myself in opposition to the amendment. In 2017, the FBI used the moniker Black Identity Extremism, BIE, to describe 6 unrelated attacks on law enforcement between 2014 and 2017. A 2019 Intercept analysis found only 1 federal prosecution related to BIE since 2001, while there had been 268 federal prosecutions of right-wing extremists in the same time period. The FBI, DHS, and DOJ have acknowledged that the largest threat within the RMVE category is white supremacists. The FBI's 2017 BIE report was wrong-headed, and I think my colleagues across the aisle know that. If anything, the report is an excellent example of what can happen when we're looking in the wrong direction. A week after the FBI BIE report was released, white supremacists held their deadly rally in Charlottesville, Virginia. In the past 20 years, only 1 BIE has been prosecuted by the federal government, just 1. Yet here we are again talking about a boogeyman that exists solely in the minds of my colleagues across the aisle and the people they frighten into believing them. Domestic terrorism, no matter its origin, is unwelcome in this country, and I'd like to hear my colleagues say the same. Amendments based on the idea that Black Lives Matter protesters are the real threat. Engaging the legal right to peacefully protest is an inherently American act. Those who seek to paint peaceful protests as violent simply because of the message those protesters are bringing are quite frankly part of the problem. Domestic terrorism is entirely different from voices peacefully crying out for change. In fact, far-right domestic terrorists, which pose the greatest threat to Americans today, seek to attack minorities and undermine minority institutions. which I'd like to remind my colleagues across the aisle is why we're sitting here today. So let's get back to the real problem. I yield back. For what purpose does Mr. Tiffany seek recognition?
Strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
I may defer to the gentleman from Florida who authored this, but the description you just gave is inaccurate. I mean, read the document here. I mean, page 12, line 2, strike white supremacist and neo-Nazi and insert neo-Nazi, white supremacist, Antifa, Black Lives Matter, and radicalized social justice organization. He put them all in there. They're all in there in this amendment. Am I correct, gentleman from Florida? Yes. So don't try to misdirect here because the gentleman from Florida's amendment is actually quite fair and is more comprehensive to make sure what most American people believe. They want rioting and the crime in our cities to stop. They don't care what color the person is. They just want it to stop. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Who seeks recognition? For what purpose does Mr. Gates seek recognition?
I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank my colleague from Florida for his leadership. I know how well he is thought of, particularly by our law enforcement community, and I appreciate what he's done with the amendment to try to really vet through some inconsistencies in the application of law to groups that are deemed right-wing versus left-wing. I am not going to be able to support the amendment, though, because I really think the biggest problem we face is the inward turning of these national security authorities against our own people for any reason, whether they're right-wing or left-wing. I've read and become very concerned about the FBI and the DOJ's targeting of groups like Marcus Garvey's group or Martin Luther King Jr.'s group or the people around Malcolm X, because at the time, the FBI was a pretty explicitly racist organization. And now that the FBI is no longer a right-wing organization, but it's a left-wing organization, I don't think that our standards on the utilization of these authorities should change. So again, I very much appreciate what my colleague from Florida is doing, and I think he makes a very valid point in the introduction of the amendment, but I won't be voting for it for those reasons.
Would the gentleman yield for a question?
I'm going to yield to my colleague from Ohio.
All right.
I thank the gentleman for yielding, and just take a few minutes. He used the term inward looking. Well, it just so happens today, 7:42 a.m. Eastern Time, the Washington Post had a story that says the FBI is spending millions on social media tracking software. Let me just read from this story, and I'll be happy to enter it in the record in a minute. The FBI has contracted for 5,000 licenses to use BabelX, a software made by Babel Street that lets users search social media sites within a geographic area and other parameters. The contract began on March 30th and is worth as much as $27 million. They're going to be surveilling anybody and everybody in some specified area. Not Matt Gaetz, not Jim Jordan, not Donald Trump, not Republicans. The Washington Post, 7 o'clock this morning, a story that's all about inward looking, the term the gentleman just talked about. I would yield back to the gentleman from Florida.
I appreciate that, and if the FBI is seeking to scrape social media information, they may be becoming less ambitious when compared to the capabilities that we've seen from the Pegasus system. Under Mr. Massey's questioning of the FBI cyber chief recently, the FBI cyber chief wants us to believe that they took a $5 million test drive on software that has been used internationally by state and non-state actors to target, wait for it, politicians, people in the media, cultural leaders. And so, the FBI is using some of the scariest software in the world that doesn't even require a click or any action by the user. It just penetrates inside your cell phone, your messages, your contents. And so Pegasus could mark the end of spear phishing as a capability or as a tactic from our adversaries because it is so able to get in the phone. So we're going to find out whether or not the FBI really is going to maintain behind closed doors that this was a test drive, that they paid $5 million just to satisfy their sense of wonderment and curiosity. And I'm grateful that Mr. Liu on the committee as well has insisted that be bipartisan. and that we join together to stop these potential infringements on liberties. I worry that the underlying legislation here that Mr. Steube is admirably trying to improve, it really gaslights the continued targeting of Americans for purposes of politics. And we've seen it enough. We've seen it repeatedly. We've seen the Attorney General share information with us that we cannot rely on. Even he cannot rely on some of the information anymore because it has been rescinded. But I will not be supporting the amendment because I do not believe that we should do this to our fellow Americans, whether they're members of Antifa, Black Lives Matter, or some other group that's deemed a thought crime or crime of bad politics in today's ethic. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Who else seeks recognition?
Mr. Chairman.
What purpose does Mr. Roy seek recognition? What purpose does Mr. Bishop seek recognition?
Strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
I thank you, Mr. Chairman. And, Mr. Gates's comments do pose a difficult problem. And I think the amendment merits support only if to flush out the full purpose of the majority. That is to say, draw them out as to whether or not this is an apolitical effort. It seems to me worse. And I think Mr. Gates is nevertheless right. And the point about the social media searching that the FBI has undertaken a $27 million contract to do, to the point Mr. Gates made about Pegasus and the ability there. Remember that we had the Assistant Director for Cyber here a week ago, I guess it was, maybe two. I think it was last week. And he said that he could offer no information about any new safeguards the FBI has adopted since 2017 to ensure that private data stores accessible to the U.S. security state, the FBI and so forth, were not being tapped by private contractors to serve their own purposes, political purposes. So at least if you're prepared to bat down any suggestion of political purpose, you would allow it to be even-handed and not only to target extremist movements associated with the right wing, but to recognize that there are many of these. Antifa's not, I guess the chairman's position continues to be that Antifa is a myth. So I think it does pose difficult problems, but this gets more and more complicated and more troubling all along. And if we are, and this notion of apparently politicizing the power of federal criminal law enforcement and to provide all these continuing, it's not that we're worried about how we correct abuses that have been going on in the past alone, but they continue to pile on additional capabilities to spy on Americans. And they use this terminology. Again, this legislation recently enjoyed bipartisan support because we didn't know that you meant something different by domestic terrorism than we thought you meant. But if you mean parents of school children are domestic terrorists and we can't get a clear answer on whether you're going to pursue that or not, the problems get harder to answer. Questions get harder to answer. So I got to support the amendment, but I got to say it really serves to emphasize that this bill is rotten under the circumstances. So I'll seek to see whether anybody wants me to yield to them. Apparently seeing none, I'll yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Who else seeks recognition? For what purposes does Mr. Roy seek recognition? I'm sorry, Ms. Dean.
Sorry.
For what purpose does Ms. Dean seek recognition?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Roy.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Yes, I move to strike the last word. I speak as opposed to this amendment, but more importantly, my goal is to redirect us to the importance of this bill and get away from these distracting faux arguments that are putting up faux information without ever going back to what is at the purpose of this bill. We know that hate crimes exist In this country, we know that hate crimes are on the rise. 8,263 hate crimes in a single year. And that's the cases we know about. 8,263. That averages to more than 22 hate crimes every single day. Of these, 62% were motivated by racial or ethnic bias. We must do better than this. We are called, as a nation, we are called as a legislative body to do better than this. Congress has the power to fight back against domestic terrorism. I don't understand why the folks on the other side of the aisle don't join us in that fight against domestic terrorism that is having the impact of terror, but is also costing lives. So today, I'm very proud to lend my support to the underlying bill that we should be focused on, H.R. 350, the Domestic Terrorism Prevention Act. The legislation requires DOJ, FBI, and DHS to provide training to assist state, local, and tribal law enforcement agencies in detecting, deterring, and defending Americans from acts of domestic terrorism and white supremacy. Finally, DTPA directs DHS, DOJ, FBI, forgive the acronyms, and the Department of Defense to establish an interagency task force to share information to combat white supremacist infiltration in the uniformed services and federal law enforcement. Ladies and gentlemen, January 6th personally reminded every person in this room, every person in this Capitol, how dangerous the combination of radicalism and hate can become. I commend Rep. Schneider, Chairman Nadler, and the other bipartisan co-sponsors of this bill for a powerful bill. I will yield the remainder of my time to anyone who seeks it. Otherwise, I yield my time, Mr. Chairman.
Gentlelady yields her time, yields back. For what purpose does Mr. Roy seek recognition?
Move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
Respectfully to my colleague Ms. Dean about the comment about faux arguments, I won't rehash the argument that I made on the Bishop Amendment. I mean, obviously it failed, but I don't believe it's a faux argument to be talking about the power of government being used to target parents. And that's very specifically what's happening. It's by definition in the whistleblower documentation and in what we know is reported about Mr. Smith. And I would just ask my Democratic colleagues to talk to Mr. Smith. Have Mr. Smith come in and then tell him that his argument is faux. Say that what happened to him or having the National School Board Association coordinate with the White House and the FBI to have a tag going after parents and then say the reason for that is a guy like Mr. Smith going to a school board. Tell him that that's a faux argument on behalf of him to say we're concerned about tracking of parents when his daughter was raped in a bathroom. I'd just like to see the look on his face when my Democratic colleagues say that it is a faux argument in defense of his liberties. I would argue on the issue at hand, I'm sympathetic to Mr. Gates's point. I'm probably persuaded along the lines of my colleague from North Carolina's point about my friend from Florida's making very clear the politicized nature of this bill, right? I mean, that's the purpose of it. It's putting a slant in the code. It's a targeting very specifically without a full context of the blindfolds of justice that we know are supposed to be rooted in our justice system going after and looking at criminal activity, regardless of why that criminal activity is occurring. The motives are what you use to go kind of figure out and track it, but the criminal activity is criminal activity. It's violence, or it's murder, or it's whatever's happening. And you can go root it out, and our law enforcement officials, and many of us in this room have served in some capacity in prosecution or attorneys general offices or whatever. Our law enforcement community is fully empowered right now to go after whoever they want to go after if they're bad guys. And the state authorities and local authorities and federal authorities, they're fully empowered to go after bad guys. So if there's bad guys, go after them. But no, we know what this is about. This is a political piece of legislation. That's what it is. And everybody objectively observing it knows it's a political piece of legislation. So we say, oh, well, BLM, the chairman said, don't say anything negative about BLM. These are peaceful protests, he said. You look at any data, we had 140 cities in 2020 with BLM protests at the root of them of $2 billion of damage, $2 billion with a B, $1 billion of damage. Stories about the BLM co-founder, Patrice Cullors, said in a Surface video from 2015 that she and her fellow organizers are trained Marxists, quote unquote. She was the protege of Eric Mann, the Weather Underground domestic terror organization, spent years absorbing the Marxist-Lenin ideology that shaped her worldview. The first thing I think is that we actually do have an ideological frame. Quote, we are trained Marxists. We are super versed on sort of ideological theories. I could go on and on. Look, my friend from Florida is simply making the point that, if you're gonna have a politicized piece of language that's focusing on a particular group, he's just simply saying, well, let's just make clear and let's focus on these other groups, but my colleagues on the other side of the aisle are gonna say no. If it's just objective, then what are you worried about? If BLM's not doing anything, then what are you worried about? Just put them in there, and if it's peaceful protest, there's no concern because the power of the FBI, apparently, according to my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, is nothing to be worried about. So just put BLM in there and say, okay, go on about your day, peaceful protesters. But you don't want to do that. And that's the plain reality of the situation, and so I will be supporting my friend from Florida's amendment. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Does anyone else seek recognition? If not, the question occurs on the amendment. All in favor say aye. Opposed, no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
I ask for a recorded vote.
Recorded vote is requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Nadler?
No.
Mr. Nadler votes no. Ms. Lofgren?
Your ability to schedule?
No.
Hire a scheduler until
Ms.
we're able to
Lofgren
do
votes
that,
no.
but
Ms. Jackson Lee? Ms. Jackson Lee? Mr. Cohen? Mr. Cohen?
all that she can do scheduling
No.
correctly, then we'll move her
Mr.
into that
Cohen
role.
votes no. Mr. Johnson of Georgia?
No. Say yes.
Mr. Johnson of Georgia votes no.
Thank you.
Mr. Deutsch?
Yes, it's very helpful.
Ms. Bass?
Bass votes no.
Ms. Bass votes no. Mr. Jeffries? Mr. Cicilline? Mr. Cicilline votes no. Mr. Swalwell?
No.
Mr. Swalwell votes no. Mr. Liu?
No.
Mr. Liu votes no. Mr. Raskin?
No.
Mr. Raskin votes no. Ms. Jayapal?
No.
Ms. Jayapal votes no. Ms. Stimmings?
No.
Ms. Stimmings votes no. Mr. Correa?
Correa votes no.
Mr. Correa votes no. Ms. Scanlon? Ms. Garcia?
No.
Ms. Garcia votes no. Mr. Neguse?
No.
Mr. Neguse votes no. Ms. McBath?
McBath votes no.
Ms. McBath votes no. Mr. Stanton?
Stanton votes no.
Mr. Stanton votes no. Ms. Dean?
No.
Ms. Dean votes no. Ms. Escobar?
No.
Ms. Escobar votes no. Mr. Jones?
No.
Mr. Jones votes no. Ms. Ross? Ms. Ross votes no. Ms. Bush?
Hey. Bush votes no.
Ms. Bush votes no. Mr. Jordan? Mr. Jordan votes yes. Mr. Shabbat?
Aye.
Mr. Shabbat votes aye. Mr. Gomert? Mr. Isa? Mr. Isa votes yes. Mr. Buck? Mr. Gates? Mr. Gates votes no. Mr. Johnson of Louisiana? Mr. Biggs? Mr. McClintock? Mr. Steube? Mr. Steube votes yes. Mr. Tiffany? Mr. Tiffany votes aye. Mr. Massey? Mr. Massey votes aye. Mr. Roy? Mr. Roy votes aye. Mr. Bishop? Mr. Bishop votes aye. Ms. Fishbach?
Aye.
Ms. Fishbach votes aye. Ms. Sparts?
Yes.
Ms. Sparts votes yes. Mr. Fitzgerald? Mr. Fitzgerald votes aye. Mr. Benz? Mr. Benz votes yes. Mr. Owens? Mr. Owens votes aye.
How is Mr. Deutsch recorded?
Mr. Deutsch is not recorded.
No.